Hello and good afternoon. Welcome. I have the honor to introduce the two keynote speakers of this afternoon. Bart Soenens and Maarten Vansteenkiste will bring a joint keynote in which they will shed a light on the proactive and resilient nature of human functioning. I think we all agree that my time is too limited to go over the impressive track records of those two. Over the past years, Maarten and Bart have significantly contributed to the extension and refinement of self-determination theory. They have published many conceptual and empirical papers, and honestly, I've lost count, but always surprising us with innovative ideas and methodologies within very diverse domains and populations. In addition to advancing the SDT research, they also substantially contribute to the application and dissemination of this theory to practice and society. And on a personal note, I have been fortunate to not only work together with these outstanding scholars for more than 10 years, but I also got to know them as two warm and authentic people breathing SDT in their role as a supervisor, as a colleague, as a mentor, and as a friend. So please give a warm welcome to Bart Soenens and Maarten Vansteenkiste.
Thank you, Nathalie, for this nice introduction. I think we are more than excited to be here today and to this joint presentation. Bart and myself, we have been collaborating since 2002, 2001, when we did our PhDs together. And at the time, actually, also Wim Beers was also around in Leuven. And the three of us moved to Ghent, and we built up there with a group of people an extensive set of studies and a research program. But I maybe also want to highlight here Wim. It's the first time Wim is here with us, and I hope he enjoys the conference, so he will come next time as well. Anyway, so we will talk today about the proactive nature, the resilient nature of human functioning. And I think one of the reasons why I got attracted to SDT very much from the beginning is because the theory is pretty clear about what kind of viewpoint on human nature underlies the theory. So I think this is really critical, this organismic view on human functioning. Because a lot of theories stay silent, I think, about these meta-theoretical assumptions. They don't have clear assumptions, but I think this organismic thinking is really the foundation of what SDT is all about. And so here is a description of what such an organismic approach involves. Organismic approaches are focused on the qualities associated with living entities, including their active tendencies to expand and express themselves while maintaining their integrity. And if you look at this sentence, and let's look at it in somewhat more detail, you can see that indeed the assumption is that as human beings, we are at the center of activity, at the center of agency, rather than being just passive recipients of contextual influences. Another assumption is here that over time, we move towards increasing levels of integration and unity. So in our functioning, we become more synthesized, more harmonious over time, both intrapersonally and interpersonally. And third, I think there's this tendency to adapt to difficult circumstances, to distressing circumstances, at least to undertake an attempt to adapt to it, and in that respect, to also mobilize coping resources to deal with struggles in daily lives. And if we think about this, and my question is now, if you think about it in your own research, I have a simple question for you. And again, it's here three options. I'm not going to ask you to stand up as in the opening talk yesterday. But my question for you, what has been your research priority so far? Have you, by yourself, been focused on the growth-promoting role of socializing agents, so more focused on the context? Have you been, second, being focused on the individual itself and how he or she can uplift her own functioning and her own growth? Or have you been focusing on both? So these are the three options. Who says, in my own research, my primary focus is A, the social context? Maybe you can raise your hand. Who would say, for me, it's B. My focus has been more on the individual. And C, a combination. So it's a little bit mixed in both. Of course, the third option is the safest one. And but today we will be talking indeed about the individual itself and how indeed this person can act in resilient ways. And of course, need satisfactions are at the center of our functioning. And you can think about the social context and about indeed the role of the individual itself. And there has been past work on this. For instance, the notion of agentic engagement speaks to this, the work by John Marshall-Reeve. There's also work on asserted autonomy by Lisa Legault. I think this is interesting work, and we try to build also on this body of work which is out there. But the talk today will just focus on the growth-oriented person. And if you think about this from, let's say, the different criteria that have been put forward to define and characterize the needs, I want to highlight one here, the directional role of the needs. And with directional, we mean that in our proactive functioning, people are not randomly moving in any kind of direction. No, there is some systematic inclination to move in a certain direction, in a specific direction. And I think the basic needs serve as what we call here experiential guideposts. They inform you whether you're on the right track. And we have that propensity to move towards situations, to move relational contacts with others, activities which are need conducive. At the same time, I think there is this tendency to correct if things go wrong, to indeed engage, mobilize coping resources to deal with need-threatening circumstances itself. And I personally like the idea of a propensity, that inclination to move towards indeed the direction of improving need satisfactions across time. And to make it more concrete, I think there are a number of mechanisms that can play a role here. And this is also informed by work in the personality psychology domain, where they talk about, for instance, the proactive mechanism, where people are selecting, making choices in the service of enhanced need satisfaction. So this will be the first part of this keynote, and the last part, which deals with the issue of need crafting. But then there are two other mechanisms as well, a more evocative mechanism and a more reactive one, and that's part two, which Bart will address. In the second mechanism, evocative, it means that you will evoke certain responses from the environment that in a way will elicit a more positive spiral or will lead to a more negative spiral. And the last one is more how you interpret the environment in such a way that it has implications for your own basic needs, and where indeed you can minimize indeed the need-threatening context or indeed suffer more from it. And so coping will be relevant there, and that's what Bart will deal with later on. So that's basically the structure of the talk. We talk about need crafting, about need-thwarting events and coping, and then our proactivity as scientists. So in terms of need crafting, I think need crafting does indeed contribute to growth and mental health. And study by study has shown this. There are meta-analysis out there, which is something which has been repeatedly been confirmed. I think the link with resilience is maybe something we have been arguing for, but we have studied it less. There's some work by Julien Bureau who has done this in this area, but it's, I think, an understudied issue, where resilience means that you're capable to adapt to the situation and handle the situation, distressing situation, better than what you could expect on average. And then, of course, if the needs are critical for resilience, the question is, what can we do to actually increase people's need satisfactions, and how can this be a target for action? So I will say something more about a study which we did on, indeed, the resilient role of need satisfactions. And this study was conducted during the COVID crisis, where in that crisis we actually collected data in a longitudinal sample, in this case about 1,900 persons who repeatedly would be filling out a set of questionnaires regarding their need satisfactions, their ill-being, and also the extent to which they were prone to health threats. And of course, on different moments in the crisis, we were exposed to a health threat. You could get infected, somebody of your relatives could get infected, and that could be distressing by itself. So these are 13 waves, and you can see here these 13 waves, a lot of variation, of course, within the person, to what extent he or she is exposed to these health-threatening encounters on a moment-to-moment basis. And so experienced threat could predict anxiety, and experienced threat itself would be function of the exposure to a health-threatening environment. The question is then, of course, how do the basic needs play a role in here? And we thought, okay, maybe needs could play a double role. And the first role is here, that it does affect the extent to which you perceive the situation as threatening to begin with. So the idea is that you will appraise the situation as less threatening if your basic needs get more fulfilled. And that effect would be there above and beyond the extent to which you are exposed to a health-threatening context. The second way how the needs may play a role is in the second part of the model, where threat would less easily translate in symptoms of depression and anxiety in case your basic needs are better met. So it suggests that basic need satisfaction serves as a buffer against the threats you experience, the health threats in the corona crisis. And so these are data collected across time, 13 measurement moments, and multi-level analysis were conducted. And in terms of our first question, what you can see here, both at the within-person level and the between-person level, you can see need satisfactions do matter in predicting reduced felt health threats above and beyond the role of objective threats to which you have been exposed. So this suggests indeed that there is something where you appraise the situation as being less threatening in case your basic needs get more fulfilled. The second issue was then, does need satisfaction predict reduced ill-being? It does, also at the between and the within-person level. So that means in periods during the COVID crisis where your needs were more satisfied, you experienced less ill-being compared to other periods where your needs were less satisfied. And this was the case also at the within and the between-person level. Maybe most interesting is here the interaction effect. And the interaction effect is really, it's about to what extent can need satisfaction serve as a buffer, mitigate some of the negative effects of being threatened in terms of your own health. And that seems to be the case. And that's the moderation effect, which is displayed here, which suggests that people who are, on average, people who are pretty concerned, so there were interpersonal differences between all of us in terms of the felt concerns during the crisis, well, especially for those people who are pretty concerned, a period of elevated need satisfaction serves to buffer against, indeed, the cost of the threat they experience. So it does suggest that it does mitigate for certain people, maybe those most in need, those most prone to health threats, well, they benefited the most from a period of elevated need satisfaction, which suggests need satisfaction plays a resilient role in dealing with the situation. And so given need satisfaction is critical, both in terms of predicting mental health, and in predicting resilience, the question is now, how can we foster this critical resource? And this is work which has been initiated already a few years ago through the work of Nele Laporte and Daphne van den Boogaarde on need crafting. And need crafting involves individuals' attempts to create optimal conditions for psychological need satisfaction to occur. So in a way, you're creating the situation so that your basic needs get better met, both in terms of context you're searching for, people you're interacting with, activities you're trying to select. And it does have two components, more an awareness component. And so it means I'm aware of where my basic needs are under threat. With which person I can easily connect. Which activities provide me a sense of effectiveness. Which persons I can actually be myself and be completely volitional in the way I interact with other people. And I'm making a choice in the service of these need-conducive activities. And so that's the action component. So it's about better realization of your interests, of your competencies, and of your intimate relationships. And so a person high on need crafting would be somebody who is, on the one hand, aware of what is indeed need conducive, and on the other hand, has the capacity and also the audacity to act on that awareness and to take action in the service of improved need satisfaction. And so here are a set of questions. Can we assess need crafting in a valid and reliable way? Is that a stable skill, or is it something that can fluctuate from week to week, from day to day? Is it something that comes with mental health benefits, and can we train people in it through an intervention? So we addressed these questions in a series of studies, in this case 3 studies. These were cross-sectional, longitudinal, and diary samples, all adolescents. And so they would be filling out these need crafting measures either on a one-shot measure on a day-to-day basis or 3 times across a longer period of time. And so one question is, can we now assess need crafting in a reliable and valid way? And this is a confirmatory factor analysis, which does suggest that it's like a multi-layered structure. At the bottom, you have awareness and action, which then has indeed autonomy crafting, competence and relatedness crafting, and the composite score of a total score of need crafting. So this has a reasonable fit. And so we have here initial evidence that indeed we can assess people's need crafting. It does predict need satisfaction positively. It is related to mindfulness, is of course that receptive stance with improved awareness. It should correlate positively with need crafting. Agentic engagement is related to it. And also proactive personality and asserted autonomy. So this provides evidence for the construct validity, and this holds up for the 3 different need crafting needs as well, or the 3 separate needs as well. So this is, I think, one important thing. Then we asked ourselves the question, is this now something stable? Is this something somebody is better at and others worse, or is this something that can fluctuate? And so what you have here is the variance decomposed in 2 components. On the one hand, between-person variance, on the other hand, within-person variance. The left is indeed a short-term longitudinal study, 3 waves. The right is a diary study. It's 7 days. In both cases, you can see that a substantial amount of variance is situated at the within-person level. So there are days where I'm more need crafting, and there are days where I'm less need crafting. So this is interesting by itself. And then the question is, on moments or days I'm crafting more, does this pay off? And this is what this slide suggests, that on moments you're crafting more, or actually you get your needs better met, and you're less likely to have your needs frustrated. And this translates then in better well-being on these days. So this is pretty promising, because it suggests it's maybe a critical resource you can rely on, you can mobilize on a day-to-day basis to actually improve your own mental health on a day-to-day basis. Interestingly, the effect of need crafting here emerged above and beyond the impact or the role of contextual need support. So contextual need support predicts need satisfaction, but uniquely, you see if you are somebody who is crafting more, you also get more from it above and beyond what the context is actually doing with you. And so, well, these studies then led us to ask the question, so, well, maybe a next step is that we develop a program which is called LifeCraft, where people can actually learn to craft their own basic needs. And so this program, this brief intervention, was actually developed during the COVID crisis and then tested in 2 samples, an adult sample and a college student sample. And, well, the program consists of a number of components. It takes 6 to 7 days, and every day you have a different component. It's online provided, so it all runs by itself. And in terms of testing the effectiveness of the program, we had a control group who was not going through the intervention, an experimental group who did, and then you have different measurement moments, baseline, post-intervention, and follow-up, to see whether indeed the program does result in any mental health benefits. Through latent change modeling, we examined the benefits of being indeed exposed to or going through such a need crafting intervention. And so, more precisely, what does the need crafting intervention exist of? It does have, again, that awareness component. And awareness was fostered in 3 different ways. We had a psychoeducational animated video around the basic needs. Then we had a set of homework exercises on a day-to-day basis addressing one of the basic needs. And then we also had inspiring testimonials. So somebody actually explaining or telling how he or she tries to actually get his or her own basic needs met. And so people would get some inspiration from it and then come up with an action plan. So what's my plan for the next day, when I'm going to invest in my basic needs, with whom, where? And so this is made very concrete in order to maximize the chance that people's actions translate really into, or intentions into, action. And so this was done 6 days in a row, and then in the 7th day you have a sort of consolidation module where we try to indeed strengthen that need crafting capacity. And so this first study among adults did suggest that indeed need crafting does result in some benefits. As you can see in the graph there, in the condition where people were in the experimental group, people were more likely to start indeed crafting. They crafted more, they experienced more need satisfaction, and so on. But interestingly, and maybe that's something you could expect also, the effect was only visible for those who are really engaging in the program. So yeah, I think it makes sense. If you're not doing the exercises, why would you benefit from the program altogether? So this is an interesting finding by itself. It's promising. And yeah, the question then was, can we now replicate this in another sample? And this time, college students, university students, we needed to redo the testimonials because you need to build in different examples where students can more easily relate to. And so in this case, this was done during an intervention. The intervention was run during a stressful exam period. And we built on some variations here. One variation was people could actually choose whether they would do the program in a single week or 2 weeks. So the pacing is something that is up to you. Second, we assessed people's motivation prior to the intervention. So why is it that you're actually engaging now in this program? And third, we again assessed people's engagement during the intervention. All of these could be potential moderators. And the main effect here does suggest that need crafting is indeed, again, improved, enhanced among those who are going through the training. This effect remains at time 2, remains there also at follow-up. And here are the other outcomes, and you see similar effects here of that intervention. Now, in terms of who is, on what does the effectiveness of need crafting really depend? Well, the intervention effect was unmoderated by the pacing. So it didn't really matter whether people were going through it in 1 single week or 2 weeks. Another finding was that in line with the previous study, there was again some evidence that program engagement was partially moderating indeed the effectiveness of the program. And this was also the case for your reason for stepping in the program to begin with. But then we also looked at the dropout, because typically in those kind of online interventions, you have a lot of dropout as well. And dropout was actually a function of the pacing. So those who were choosing the longer, the more delayed way, let's say, of going through it in 2 weeks, they were more likely to drop out. Also, those who are more autonomously motivated, well, those people were more likely to stay into the program. So on the left, you can see the autonomously motivated people and contrasted with those who had a double motive, a double motivation, both autonomous and control to step in. And so these were the ones who were more likely to drop out. But if they stayed into the program, they did also benefit. So it's pretty interesting here how motivation to step in is actually serving as a filter also and is explaining, let's say, the effectiveness of the program. So let me summarize this first part. Given that growth and resilience, given the growth and resilience fostering role of need satisfaction, the notion of need crafting deserves our attention. Need crafting as a multi-component skill involving both awareness and action can be reliably and validly assessed, is variably engaged in on a day-to-day basis, can be successfully fostered through a brief intervention, with resulting benefits for one's mental health, especially when people are engaged in the program. And so if you think about applications, I'm pretty excited about this, because I think about in clinical care, for instance, you could build this in. SDT has a lot to say about how the clinician can relate to the person in an autonomous supportive counseling way. But now we can say, okay, you need to focus also on certain issues here. You need to focus on need satisfaction. This is critical to build action around this to energize the person. Also in schools, for instance, we have a lot in Flanders where they engage in conversations with the students. You need to build, indeed, these conversations around those basic needs. So what is it at school that gives you a sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness? And let's train teachers around these dynamics. So does that mean now that the context doesn't play a role at all? No, I would say that in general, it's a capacity that is unfolding over time. It's like a developmental task for all of us. And especially in adolescence, where they need to learn to make adequate choices, I think also they need people around them to help them those need-conducive choices. And so I think, for instance, the work around fostering inner valuing or learning to deal with uncertainty and accept it is maybe interesting to think about critical components of how need crafting can be supported to begin with. So I've been talking about need satisfaction, and among the two of us, Bart and me, Bart is really the specialist in need frustration, so I'm going to turn it to him now, and we go moving to the second part.
Wow, I hope I'm not deaf by now. So hi everyone, welcome to part 2. Maarten has been discussing mainly the issue whether people to some extent can create proactively conditions to obtain more needs satisfying experiences, with need satisfaction in turn then strengthening their resilience to stress, signaling indeed resilience. And that's all fine and well, of course, but another important question is, what happens if people's needs are directly threatened by need-thwarting social conditions? So what happens if you are an adolescent raised in or by intrusive, controlling parents, for instance? Or imagine that you're a student in a classroom with a controlling teacher. Is the situation then entirely hopeless? Or can your agency, your resilience still show under those difficult conditions? You see, those are more complicated, difficult questions. I think Maarten, on purpose, assigned to himself the easy part of the presentation and gave me the more complicated parts. But these questions are important because, as we all know, life is no pony farm. I don't know if this is a common expression in English, but I did see that you can buy a t-shirt on the internet if you want. We do say this in Dutch. We say, het Leben is geen ponykamp. I also like the expression in German, das Leben ist kein Ponyhof. And what it means is that life can be tough. Chances are that you will encounter need-thwarting conditions. And depending on how you cope with those conditions, you will either be okay, perhaps even learn from those experiences, or you might suffer and develop risk for problems in your life. And it's true, life is no pony farm. Many studies in SDT have demonstrated this. This is an example, data by Young and colleagues, showing that if you are confronted with a controlling teacher in the classroom, then students typically experience more need frustration, which can elicit more disengagement. And then typically teachers respond to disengagement by increasing control, by becoming even less autonomy supportive. And so there's a negative spiral that is being set in motion. And this is what Caspi and Roberts refer to as evocative processes, because the student's behavior elicits a certain response in the teacher. And also in the domain of parenting, many studies have shown such evocative effects. This is a study we did a long time ago, a longitudinal study dealing with psychologically controlling parenting. So this is about parents who use intrusive tactics such as guilt induction, love withdrawal, and shaming. And this study showed that psychologically controlling parenting increases risk for depressive symptoms. And then in turn, depressive symptoms elicit more psychologically controlling parenting in turn. So probably parents get concerned, maybe even annoyed by the withdrawn, depressed behavior of their adolescent, and then resort to more controlling practices as a quick fix for these problems. So clearly, there's a risk that people can get caught in negative, vicious cycles, indicating bidirectional process. And these bidirectional processes are about mutually reinforcing quantitative changes within relationships. But does that mean that there's nothing you can do as a person to escape from those cycles, to break the cycle? Not necessarily, because in addition to bidirectional processes, also transactional processes are at work. And these refer to more profound qualitative changes in the very nature of the relationship. So this is about reactions that can really turn the tides, things you can do to really change the very nature and quality of the dynamics with your parents, for instance. And a very important part of those transactional, more reactive processes are the coping responses that individuals use to deal with need-thwarting conditions. And that's what I would like to talk about for a while. So in our own research, and this is mainly research done by Nele Flamand, in our group, we have examined in detail how adolescents cope with controlling parenting in particular. And to do so, we relied mainly on this model developed by Ellen Skinner, which distinguishes between 4 coping responses that are distinguished on the basis of 2 dimensions. And one dimension is whether, as an adolescent, you concede or not with controlling parental requests and rules. So for instance, if your parent is forbidding you in a domineering way to still play video games, it's the question whether you will concede with that request or not. And the other dimension is about whether your response will be more autonomous or non-autonomous in nature. Will you, in your response, stay true to yourself, be authentic, or not? So will your response allow you to behave in a way that is still consistent with your preferences, goals, and interests, or not? That's the second dimension. And so by crossing those 2 dimensions, we can differentiate 4 coping strategies, the most examined one of which is oppositional defiance. So this is clearly about adolescents who do exactly the opposite of what parents demand through a controlling request. This is about adolescents who, by definition, reject the parental authority, who do not even consider it for 1 minute internally. And then another non-autonomous response is compulsive compliance. This is about adolescents who suppress the negative feelings that are associated with a controlling request and who obey passively, even though they really strongly disagree with the request. And then we have 2 more autonomous, potentially autonomous responses. With negotiation, adolescents indicate clearly their non-agreement with the parental rule or request, and they try to find a compromise between their own preferences and goals and the parental requests. And the last strategy is accommodation. This is an autonomous form of concession, which involves a sort of mental reappraisal. Adolescents then try to see the personal value, the meaning that a controlling request would have for themselves. So they try to look behind the controlling communication to see the parents' good intentions so that they can perhaps internalize even controlling communication. So to give you an idea of how we measured this, in the studies that we did, we typically provided first adolescents with an item stem describing a situation where parents are controlling. This was brief, and most adolescents had no problem whatsoever to imagine such situations. So this was a brief primer, and then we provide adolescents with items reflecting the 4 coping strategies. So an example for negotiation is, I explain to my parents that I feel pressured and I ask if there are other ways to deal with the situation. Compulsive compliance, I do not show how I feel and I just do what I was told. Oppositional defiance, I clearly give my own opinion and I simply deny my parents' request. And then accommodation, I try to understand that my parents mean well. And so using this measure in a first longitudinal study with 3 annual waves of data in almost 200 families, we examined whether those coping strategies would moderate associations between psychologically controlling parenting and developmental problems, internalizing distress and externalizing behaviors. And our hypothesis, of course, was that the non-autonomous responses would worsen things because then you get kind of alienated from yourself, which can have an emotional cost, but which can also elicit defensive, more aggressive behaviors. The 2 more autonomous responses would be more adaptive in nature and might buffer or protect against negative consequences of psychologically controlling parenting. So adolescents provided self-reports of perceived parenting and their coping responses, and we had a multi-informant assessment of internalizing and externalizing problems. So let's take a look at the non-autonomous responses first. As expected, oppositional defiance worsened things. So the association between psychologically controlling parenting and externalizing problems in behaviors in particular was more pronounced when adolescents engaged in oppositional defiance. So oppositional defiance seems to add fuel to the fire, resulting in more aggression when confronted with controlling parenting. And a similar exacerbating effect was obtained with compulsive compliance, but this time, interestingly, with internalizing problems as the outcome. So if you passively obey a lot with controlling practices, then the odds are larger that you pay an emotional cost. And so it's interesting that different coping responses can maybe explain some of the multi-finality associated with controlling parenting, and that they kind of catalyze the consequences of controlling parenting either towards externalizing problems or internalizing distress. And then let's take a look at negotiation as a potentially more autonomous response. Surprisingly, there we did not find that it played an adaptive role. So instead of buffering the effects of psychological control, it also worsened the association between psychologically controlling parenting and internalizing problems. That was a puzzling finding to us, and we wanted to know whether it would replicate in the context of a different type of controlling parenting. And so we did another study dealing with overprotective parenting. And much like psychologically controlling parenting, this is parenting that is domineering in nature, but there are a couple of differences. Overprotective parenting is about parents who are excessively involved, given the adolescent's age and developmental abilities. So these are parents who treat their adolescent as a baby, who solve problems prematurely before the adolescent gets the chance to solve problems independently. And in contrast to psychological control, which typically goes together with cold and distant parenting with a certain harshness, overprotective parenting can be combined with a certain parental warmth. So it's a bizarre combination of controlling, but also more relatedness supportive practices. And so we did a study, a cross-sectional study, again examining how adolescents cope with that type of controlling parenting. And this time, interestingly, strikingly, we found that compulsive compliance in particular played the most pronounced role. Not oppositional defiance this time, which had no moderating role at all. It was compulsive compliance that strengthened the association between overprotective parenting and need frustration. That played an exacerbating role. And so it's interesting that this time oppositional defiance in the context of overprotection did not play a role. I think it's not easy with overprotective parents to be rebellious because they mean so well for you. They have these good intentions that creates loyalty conflicts, and it's difficult to escape through defiance from the smothering parenting climate that is created by these overprotective parents. And then we were curious, of course, whether the effects of negotiation would again be maladaptive, but that was not the case this time. This time, negotiation did play the theoretically anticipated adaptive role, buffering associations between overprotection and need frustration. And another puzzling finding was that accommodation did not play the protective role that we had anticipated. It even worsened the association between overprotective parenting and aggression. So I guess that by now you're kind of confused with all these findings. I told you in the beginning, it's complicated issues. If we zoom out a little bit, what is consistent, or rather consistent, is that the non-autonomous strategies seem to worsen matters. To some extent, it explains the multi-finality associated with controlling parenting. And depending on the type of controlling parenting, other responses seem to play a more prominent role. But the real mystery is with the autonomous strategies. So negotiation seems to have contradictory effects. Accommodation unexpectedly has detrimental effects. And so to explain this a little bit, we figured that perhaps the duration of your use of these coping responses can play a role. Maybe it's fine and okay if you accommodate every now and then, but it becomes a problem if that becomes a habit. If you accommodate all the time, maybe it's no longer a truly autonomous strategy, and you start to drift away from your personal preferences. And also, how these strategies are combined in adolescence functioning might also play a role. So maybe accommodation is favorable if it is combined with a negotiation as another autonomous strategy, and more problematic if it is combined with compulsive compliance as a non-autonomous strategy. And in one 7-day diary study with about 160 parents, where we asked every day how they cope with daily psychological control, we indeed found that if adolescents accommodate to parental psychological control in the day on a daily basis, then this plays a buffering role. So on that daily, more short-time basis, accommodation does play the protective role that we had anticipated. So maybe occasional accommodation is a good thing, and habitual accommodation becomes more of a problem. And in another study where we used person-centered analysis, cluster analysis, we then also examined combinations, profiles that combine different coping responses. And we indeed found, next to other profiles, one profile where adolescents combined accommodation with negotiation. So they seem to have two autonomous responses available in their repertoire. Maybe they could flexibly switch between those autonomous responses. But there were also adolescents who combined accommodation with passive compliance. So those adolescents seem to be passive overall when confronted with overprotective parenting. And those combinations made a major difference in terms of associations with need frustration. You can see here that in the flexible profile, so the adolescents combining the two autonomous strategies, the association between overprotective parenting and need frustration was basically absent. It was gone. While in the passive profile, the association was the strongest. So depending on whether accommodation is combined with one or the other strategy, the effects are very, very different. And the best case scenario is where you combine the two autonomous strategies together. And then there's still the mystery of negotiation, which had very inconsistent effects. And because we were surprised about this, we began to wonder whether perhaps the effects of negotiation depend on how negotiation is received by the adults, by the parents. And maybe negotiation is effective only if parents are open to consider your negotiation. And so we started to examine in one very cool vignette-based study conducted by Nele Flamand. She presented his work this morning, so I will not repeat that work, but just give a few highlights. We started to examine factors that can determine whether parents are more or less open to adolescents' negotiation attempts. And what we found, for instance, is that parents are less welcoming of negotiation if the adolescents themselves use a controlling style of communication. Then the parents themselves become defiant. They also welcome negotiation less if safety issues are at hand, because then that's alarming to them. And we also found that parents with right-wing beliefs were less inclined to accept negotiation attempts. I don't know if it's okay to say this in the state of Florida, but apparently parents with right-wing beliefs think negotiation is too woke, and they consider it as a threat to their personal authority. And so this shows how complicated these things can be, how we need to consider both the adolescent side, the parent side, and how it's really a very transactional process that is going on. So where does this leave us? There's some good news, not a lot. We began to identify a couple of autonomous responses that kind of buffer against the effects of controlling parenting, if at least they are used in combination. But there's also bad news. These buffering effects are limited. Many of the interactions that we examined were not significant. Sometimes they do not entirely cancel out the negative effects of controlling parenting, and the effects are pretty dependent on various factors, including the duration with which you use those responses. And maybe even more important, ironically and a bit tragically, the more adolescents are exposed to controlling conditions, the more they use exactly those responses that do not help and that even worsen things. Said differently, the more you are exposed to controlling practices, the less you use those responses that could turn the tide and help you. So it seems like if we combine part 1 and 2, as soon as people are exposed to need-thwarting environments, the situation is not entirely hopeless, but still very difficult. It becomes difficult to be entirely safe from harm. And so compared to the limited effects of individuals' reactive attempts to cope with need-thwarting environments, the effects of what Maarten discussed, proactive need crafting, are more straightforward. So need crafting might be a better, stronger target for intervention and prevention. And so that raises the question, shouldn't plan A still be to support adults, socialization figures, to be as need supportive as possible? And how can we create conditions, both at the level of individuals' social microsystems and at the societal level, that allow people to display their proactive potential to the fullest? And that's an issue Maarten will talk about for a few more minutes.
Thank you, Bart. I'm now going to turn again to an easy part of this talk. So I think part 3 deals with the issue of proactivity, not so much among the adolescents, but maybe among all of us, and how we as scientists can take up a more proactive role in trying to influence policies. And the Motivation Barometer project is in that respect, I think, an example, and that's something I wanted to share with you, because maybe it's inspiring in some ways for all of us. So I think in that project, the general idea of that project was to assess, to monitor people's psychological functioning on a day-to-day basis. In the beginning, daily, after a while, weekly. And we wanted to assess the psychological temperature, so to speak, of the population during the COVID crisis. And the purpose was indeed to bring psychological aspects to the attention of different stakeholders. So to make sure that it's not just perceived as a medical crisis, but also as a psychological one. And in that respect, I think we tried to do our best to collect the data and to come up with also reports which were easily distributed or quickly distributed to key stakeholders in society and also to politicians. And so these are the data here collected throughout the pandemic of people's motivation to adhere to the measures. And you can see in March 2020, when there was the first lockdown in Belgium, we started assessing people's motivation, and we did so throughout the entire pandemic till indeed May 2020, and 22 better. And in that respect, you can see ups and downs in autonomous motivation, in controlled motivation, and aim motivation. And the numbers refer actually to different reports we launched on these moments. So we assessed among thousands of people on a given moment, for instance, their motivation, their risk perception, their mental health, and then we came out with specific focused reports because there were certain hot issues out in the public debate, and we wanted to have an impact on policymakers in that respect. For instance, report 17 focused on what makes for a happy Christmas in 2020, on a moment we were facing a lockdown, and what are people's preferences in terms of the number of social contacts they would like to have on that moment. I think one of the issues about the Barometer project is we were very dynamic in assessing people's psychological functioning. So in our country, at least, there were some instances or some projects where they would have assessments, let's say, on predetermined moments, for instance, monthly. What we did is, okay, there is a new issue coming up, face masks, for instance, should they be made mandated or not? Christmas, for instance, how do we spend Christmas with others? This was the issue, the topic on the moment, so we launched a new online questionnaire that dealt with that issue. So that's why, and I think Joachim referred to this as fast science. We needed really to handle or to act very quickly to be very dynamic. And so the focus was really also the focus on the process underlying, for instance, mental health. The focus was on the processes underlying people's behavior. So basic needs were at the core of our assessments. People's motivation were at the core. Because, of course, on the basis of SDT, we know that by investing in needs, well, these are the precursors of people's mental health. By investing in motivation, you can avoid that people, or you can promote adherence in the long run and avoid that the numbers go up. And so our scope was both in terms of methodology and in terms of topics very broad, and it was embedded within diverse academic and policy structures. And so this group of academics, and it was really an inter-university project with representatives of 5 different universities in Belgium, well, we worked intensively together, and it was embedded both scientifically, here you can see on the left, there was scientifically anchored within a larger network of academics in Belgium who are all very much involved in psychology. It was entitled Psychology and Corona Expert Group. And then on the other hand, it was also embedded within a multidisciplinary expert committee, because I served as the only psychologist on that committee to provide inputs from a psychological perspective, how we could deal with motivational issues and mental health issues. And on the right, you can see indeed, we were also societally well anchored, because through these reports, this came in the news all the time almost, because the newspapers were calling us and asking, so to what extent are people still motivated? They are on the point of introducing new measures, so is the population ready for it? And so in this way, really, I think the issue of mental health and motivation was for a long time something that people got to know, and that our work was really, I think, something that was out there in the media and in the public debate. Overall, almost 500,000 participants participated, and of course, that's a wealth of data, as you can see here. But I think I want to highlight one study here, which I find particularly intriguing, because the daily assessment of motivation, needs, and well-being across the pandemic allowed us to address a number of exciting questions. And in the public debate, there was a lot of discussion in Belgium about how stringent the measures should be. And some people were really against stringent measures. Others were welcoming them and saying, okay, they're needed here. We are in threatening situations, so it's really critical they are introduced. Others would say, yeah, but these stringent measures, well, my mental health is, I'm suffering from them. My autonomy is threatened and deprived because of your stringent measures. And so what we did here is, because we have multiple days of assessments, and also we have multiple days, of course, of the hospitalization rates and the stringency of the measures on a given date. And so what we did in this study is we link objectively stringency indices on a daily basis and objective hospitalization numbers with variation in people's motivation and mental health across the pandemic. And so what you have here is the scores for motivation. So autonomous is the blue, controlled red, and an orange A motivation, and you have on the left strict measures under two conditions. Strict measures under conditions when hospitalization load was low, that's the left. And on the right, you see when the hospitalization load was high, you see a different pattern. And so the question is, do strict measures now undermine people's motivation and mental health? The answer is no. What really matters is the proportionality. Is it the case that the measures, the stringency of the measures, is aligned with the health threat that was prevailing in society? And if that was the case, you can see that the functional significance, and that's a critical concept within SDT, is different. People are more willing to accept the strict measures because they are legitimately introduced given the threats we are facing. The other question you can ask is, do lenient measures foster mental health? And the answer here is no. What you have on the right is lenient measures when the hospitalization load was high, and here on the left, you have strict measures when the hospitalization load was high. And so if you compare the two, what you can see is if the measures were lenient, yet the hospitalization load was high, people became anxious. So on that moment, introducing stricter measures actually helped people to better deal with the situation. And again, proportionality is what matters here. So the overall conclusion here is, I think the evidence coming from this project, well, it does illustrate that SD was really a very useful framework, both in predicting adherence, in predicting ups and downs in motivation, in predicting ups and downs in mental health and basic needs. And I think it's time to give back to society. And what we have encountered during that enterprise, that journey with the Motivation Barometer project, is that it is really a bumpy road. It's not something straightforward. And on some moments, for instance, you needed to be very creative in the way how you translate our knowledge at the population level. For instance, we suggested at some point when there was the vaccination rollout that rather than going completely in a linear age-bounded manner, under the age of 35, for instance, we reasoned that under that age, maybe we should randomly invite people. Because the chance for instance, a 20-year-old to be severely sick after an infection, or a 34, is more or less similar. So from a medical perspective, there are less reasons or arguments to go down in a linear manner. Also, what you do then, you ask people randomly, you invite them, and if people want to postpone vaccination, Well, it's an act of solidarity. It's a pro-social act, and so you leave the spot to somebody else. You leave the spot to the younger generations who are facing summer vacation and at that moment are really deprived in their basic needs. So these were things that are put on the table, not accepted, but I think it was really interesting and difficult to kind of find a way to work ourselves to make sure that our work was heard and how we could balance, let's say, concerns for mental and physical health. And this is a quote from Luc Pelletier and Rachi in the recent SDT handbook. So when individuals' motivation becomes more autonomous, a bottom-up process could happen. That is, individuals could become active agents in proximal contexts, for instance, in educational environments, and a source of political and societal change in distal contexts to the benefit of others. So I think the work in SDT, we have been building up a lot of knowledge, and it's time to give back. In that respect, I think, for instance, and Frank Martela refers to this in these international assessments of mental health, it's critical we have the basic needs integrated there. Another example in Belgium is Mood Space. It's a platform for students where they can find all kinds of information around psychoeducational topics. SDT is really at the center in that platform. And it's monitored also the mental health now on a yearly basis. And this is also due, I think, to the Motivation Barometer project, which was seen by the Minister of Education. He talks about the ABC in Flanders. He knows what it is about. And so we are now moving to also secondary schools, where we have yearly assessments of motivation and mental health, where SDT can be of added value. Thank you for your attention.
We have only 1 more minute for questions.
Hello, thank you for such a great talk. I have a slightly difficult question for Bart. You handled the other difficult part so well. So I'll come to you a difficult question that I often get asked. So I also study regulatory strategies in the context of affect and self-regulation. I've also started looking at different combinations. And one of the difficult but interesting questions that I often get is it that people use strategies concurrently or one after another? Because those seem to have important different implications for like regulatory processes. So I'm wondering if that's something you've teased apart, and if not, have you given that any sort of thought in the context of the work that you've been doing?
We didn't examine that issue yet, but it's an important question. I think underlying the use of different responses, I think reflective functioning in people is very important, that they first reflect about their feelings in the situation, and then volitionally choose one of the responses that suits the situation best. So I think they first need to maybe even go through a process of integrative emotion regulation, which can then allow them to use the right strategy in that situation. Yeah. So examining the interplay also with emotion regulation could be very interesting, I think.
Cool, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Question on the proactive need crafting aspect. I was wondering, how does this relate to the wide literature on proactive work behavior and job crafting? In our work on needs-based crafting, coming from the 2020 integrative needs model of crafting, we've been trying to be mindful of connecting those literatures. So on the other hand, psychological needs and recovery from work literature, and on the other hand, the proactive work behavior literature. So I was curious on your thoughts on that.
I think the two should definitely be related. I think job crafting has maybe more to do with the conditions, like to what extent are you capable of eliciting indeed job resources and avoiding more demanding situations, job characteristics at work. I think here with SDT, maybe we take a somewhat more theory-driven approach to begin with, because we really put the basic needs at the center. And I think the result, of course, of, for instance, focusing on competence could be that then you go out to your supervisor and you ask for feedback, or you signal your interests. So I think these different mechanisms that we talked about, the proactive and the evocative, they could be related to one another. And the question will be whether need crafting also leads to you evoking more motivating response of changing indeed the conditions under which you're working. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I see that the workshops have started or are about to start, so thank you for your insightful talks, and if you have more questions, you know who they are.